it's administration of the state that deals with the industrial policy, other issues related to economy and the special competitiveness of companies, of enterprises, market issues. And somehow we are also part of the Italian sanction institutions that deal with the sanction system, the sanction environment, at least because we try to measure the impact of sanctions on the companies, on the Italian companies. So sanctions are costs for Italian companies that are put according to some legal obligations in order to produce some effects on the security level. So we pay an economic cost in order to gain advantages or to produce results in the security field. So it's very interesting to measure, to analyze, to discuss this bargain between economy and security. Basically, this is what sanctions are about, is the grammar of conflict inside an economic dimension. So where the private sector is asked to not to do some things, is an exception to general principle of freedom of enterprises, of trade, because of reasons that are not economic, non-market reasons. And this poses many, many questions, especially because the sanctions are a constantly evolving system. We are very familiar with for example, one of the most comprehensive, most recent one is the Russia European sanction system. We have 14 different packages already approved. We could discuss only about that. But we will not discuss specifically about Russia. Today we will discuss in general, we will have a more macro approach. We will discuss especially what is the relation between sanctions and globalization. Before giving the floor to the speakers, I just want to say that we have to think to sanctions not as the only tool or the only aspect of economic security. Economic security is the key word. When we apply to free market the issue of national security, we enter into a new domain that is economic security. That is a very important domain, very relevant for the policy making of today. And but we know that sanctions are just a part. So the big box is economic security. Inside economic security, there are other tools, other instruments, like trade restrictions, export controls, for example. Screening of incoming investments inside one country, what in Italy we call the golden power. Or now, this is also an issue, US already has a legislation, Europe is discussing, the screening the outgoing investments, outbound investments. So this is also, these are all tools of the economic security. And sanctions are a very peculiar one. They have a long history, and we will start also discussing of the evolution of this history. So I will ask to Francesco Giumelli from the Groningen University that has published extensively on the issue of sanctions. If he can trace the history of why we have so many sanctions today, where we started from, and how do they evolve, and what is the state of the art today of the debate about sanctions. Please, Francesco.
Yes, thank you very much for inviting me here. Of course, thank you, Paolo, also for these very kind words. I was thinking about saying something about sanctions, then you asked me this question, which is going to be a challenge because I've been working on sanctions for a while. And if you ask me to give you an overview of sanctions, I might speak for much longer than 10 minutes, but I'll try to contain myself. I'll try to address the question of what sanctions look like today, also by using the question that we have for the panel. So basically, whether sanctions are the tombstone of globalization. This is a classic question that we're now hearing, especially since February 2022. Well, the answer, as any any university teacher, I need to tell the students, every time you start speaking, the first thing you have to say is the message of your talk. So the answer to the question is that I'm not sure whether it's going to be the end of globalization, but certainly, or very likely, we're going to see a different globalization than the globalization that we have seen so far, and especially how we make sense of globalization when we think about this. Because if you think about this if anybody asks you what's globalization is, you can travel, you can trade, you can buy things that are made in China with raw material that comes from Africa, with a shipping company that is maybe from Venezuela and the flag of convenience of a vessel that is from Belize. This is what globalization looks like to you. And maybe the future is not going to be like that. And that is kind of the question and the answer to the question that I have for you today. And I will try to argue for these answers in a couple of steps. The first step of the three things I want to say is indeed about sanctions. I've been working on sanctions since 2005. And for people like me, but also other folks that are way more knowledgeable and experienced than me, this is not new stuff. We knew already the sanctions, in the way sanctions were being implemented in the early thousands, were going to cause this. We have seen this 15 years ago already. There were signs of how nations, companies were going to react to this. So when you think about sanctions, what you think of sanctions on Russia, sanctions on Cuba, sanctions on Myanmar. Sanctions are not imposed on countries anymore. So when you think about sanctions, sanctions are 90% of the times they are targeted. So they're targeting companies. And this started in the late 90s, where basically there were a couple of terrorist attacks in Africa, and the people that were responsible for this didn't belong to any state. So we didn't know who to target. And then the big change happened with the terrorist attacks of 9/11. Again, you have the responsible individuals, and no states want to take the responsibility for that, because these individuals are normally also enemies in the countries where they are. So the Security Council, with the practice that started 1 year earlier, then they go after individuals. How many of you study international relations here? Raise your hand. I just said something very weird. I said that the Security Council imposed sanctions on individuals. Now, for you, it might make sense, because you lived now for 23 years in a situation where the Security Council indeed imposes sanctions on individual. Can any of you point anywhere in the UN Charter that the Security Council can actually impose sanctions on individual? Did any of you sign the UN Charter? Now, this is still a contested issue, because at some point, the Security Council started to say, Francesco Giumelli is a bad guy. So what happens? I make mandatory for all member states of the UN to freeze my bank accounts. No justification, no reasoning, no email, no notification. There is the case, the Nada case. This Egyptian guy living in Canton Ticino in Switzerland. Until very recently, there was a super interesting interview that was still on YouTube. And the guy said, well, listen, at some point they tried to pay with my bank account, with my card, and the bank account was frozen. And then I called the Swiss authorities and listen, I called the bank. And the bank said, well, we're just implementing what the Swiss government is telling us to do. Well, then he called the Swiss government. And then the Swiss government told him, listen, but we're just doing what the UN told us to do. And then he tried to call the UN, and the UN didn't respond, because the UN does not talk to individuals. The UN is an association of states. It's not an association of individuals. This sounds like a different geological era compared to today, because today there are mechanisms according to which there is an email address that you individuals can use to get in touch with the Security Council. But 23 years ago, there was science fiction, because it was not normal. And that's the beginning of this story. It's the beginning of a story where companies could have been sanctioned by the UN without justifications and without companies being prepared for this. And then, of course, this comes from member states. Especially one member state was pretty adamant in imposing sanctions with this kind of attitude. And then the United States which is the state. I didn't want to spoil it, but then it came out right away. And then the United States started to use this kind of tool very assertively, and not only against US companies, against non-US companies, which means that anyone on the planet could have been fined or prosecuted in the US for violation of US laws, even if you were committing an act outside of the US territory. That's second revolution. First, the UN Security Council comes after you. Then a nation state picks up the practice and it goes after you anywhere on the planet. This is not what I studied when I was going to the university. I was told that if you go to a country, then you need to follow the laws of the country. But if you are outside of the country, then why should you follow the laws of that country? This is, well, to an international lawyer, this is actually not, this was never existed. It was always the case that there were some laws that would follow you because of your passport, not where you were committing an action, but very often because you hold a certain passport, then you could still try. In the Romans' time, we were in Rome, the Roman Empire, Roman citizens had certain laws that were different from the others. So that was not entirely new, but in practice, we were not used to this. So what happened since the basically mid-2000s, we have seen this practice of states going around the globe, imposing sanctions on individuals and companies, to the point that sanctions were not only an action of security, but they became a political instrument, something that would touch anyone. At some point, due to UN sanctions, if you were selling a book on Amazon and you didn't know the buyer, and the buyer happened to be in a country where a nuclear bomb was being produced, and your book was about how to build a nuclear bomb, you could have faced prosecution in your own country because you were selling a book on Amazon. And this is the world that is changing. And that is point number 2 of my story. That assertiveness of the US triggered a lot of other states to do the same. And then it created a lot of confusions. Think about you as a company selling, actually, these are real stories. You sell something to another company in another country, and you have a contract. You ask for an advance payment, you get the money, sanctions come, and then you cannot send your stuff anymore. So the buyer doesn't have the money, it doesn't have the stuff. And there is nowhere written in the contract that if sanctions hits the situation here, then you cannot comply. So a lot of arbitrations were triggered by the fact that international contracts did not have the sanctions clause. Of course, the force majeure clause was being invoked, but it was a different story. There was not a practice for that. We have created a situation where you are responsible for who you, for what you sell, and who do you sell it to? This is, again, a different story. And this is a principle that is not completely new. If you go to a bank and you go with a lot of money, the bank will ask you, where did you get the money? This is actually only something that comes after the 80s. It wasn't there before. But now, if you sell things, especially if they are in a sensitive technology or products that are in the list, you need to know who is the buyer. You cannot claim, I didn't know who was the buyer, because you face prosecution, which means that you, a bank, whatever, you need to do an investigation on the customers. This is, again, another revolution in the sense we started to say globalization is you can buy and sell to whoever you want, wherever you want. Well, that's not the world anymore. You cannot do that, because if you do this for certain goods, then you go to jail. If I have in my classes someone from, let's say, the DPRK, which is in UN terms, North Korea, and I'm teaching something that can be used by a Korean citizen to evade sanctions or to build a bomb, my university is liable and I can go to jail. It's something that it's called export control, as Paolo has already mentioned. Now, we used to think about export as I sell you this notebook and you get this notebook. But if I tell you something and you walk across the border, you're exporting knowledge. And in a knowledge-based society, knowledge is what matters, not so much the things. And again, even knowledge became an issue. So we're now living in a world where it's not only what you sell, but what, who is the buyer? And then what does the buyer want to do with the things you're selling them? So we are asking a bank or any company to basically check the intentions of a buyer. This is not a globalization where you can buy and sell whatever you want to whoever you want, because you need to know who is the buyer, and not only who is the buyer, but what do they want to do with your stuff? Otherwise, you become liable. This is a very different world than the world that we used to live in. And then, of course, that's the third point I want to go, and then I need to not to be abusive of your generosity and kindness time-wise. But then we move to the third point, the reactions. That's something that is not easy to capture. But if you start, again, as an IR scholar, what you study is that economic interdependence favors peace, because of course, you can commerce, you can trade, and then everybody will treat you the same. The GATT, the World Trade Organization, is based on the principle of reciprocity. If I can sell you things with no tariffs, then you can do the same thing with me and with your goods. We live in an era where, in a lot of countries, with something that we call populism, we live on this hubris that you can simply say, I don't sell you these things anymore, thinking that nothing happens. If you stop giving money to a friend of yours, what is the first thing that the friend of yours can do to you? If I slap you, what happens to you? And what happens to me afterwards? Sorry? You get angry and then you look like a big guy. So that means that you can also slap back, right? Yes. If you start imposing export regulations on others, the others will do the same to you. This week, China created a dual-use list. Now, even the Chinese are now asking the Chinese sellers, you need to check who is the buyer, because if the buyer is Lockheed Martin, and Lockheed Martin happens to work with the US government, then you can't sell anything to Lockheed Martin. Again, very different globalization, because then everyone is doing that. Russia imposed sanctions on European citizens, on European companies, Brazilians, South Africans. This is becoming the new normal. If you start imposing restrictions on others, the others will do that to you. And that's the first reaction that happens. The second reactions that you see is that if you can check on my capacity to be dependent on you, I'll try to be as independent as possible. One of the things that the US government has used as an argument to basically enforce sanctions is the dependency on other nations on the US dollar. Well, the others are saying, fine, we're going to use other currencies. And as soon as they use other currencies, they start using different systems of payments. Because again, I'll use this example and then I'll wrap up to the conclusion. If you want to buy things from China today, or if you want to, when you go to Japan and then you go on vacation, you use your card and then you pay very easily. And then you don't even withdraw money anymore nowadays when you travel, because you simply go and pay with your card. This is not a gift from God. This is an institutional and physical infrastructure that has been built because states wanted to facilitate payments. So don't take it for granted, because you can unplug these situations, and then you can have governments that might have an incentive from preventing you from using that kind of infrastructure. Go to China and use Google, for instance. You go to the DPRK and try to pay with your credit cards. Go to Russia or send money with your bank now and write in the justification for the payment, Russia. Let's see whether the payment goes through. So the idea here is that there is a reaction to these kind of things that we started to see 20 years ago. And the reaction is creating islands where if you belong to a certain island, then you can make payments. If you do not belong to that, a group of economies that are friends with each other, then you cannot make payments. These phenomena are, of course, we use English terms. We went from offshoring to friend shoring. So we make sure that the integration takes place with countries and where there are governments that might be close to us, instead of just anywhere where it's cheaper. Again, very different understanding from the globalization that we have today. But wrapping up, so I recently wrote a small volume on sanctions, and in the final chapter, I try to reflect what the future looks like. Of course, we are political scientists, so we should never do this because we're not wizards, but we are only political scientists. So we look at the past. But trying to play this lottery game with the future, one scenario is that this readjustment is going to be very, very slow. So what we're going to see is more of the same, more sanctions, more of the countries that have some kind of power situations in relation with others, they will keep using sanctions. The second scenario is this fragmentation of the globe as we know it. So the creation of groups, islands of economies, friends, countries that stick together. And then what we're going to be looking at is sanctions imposed within blocks, but not across blocks, because the blocks will not touch each other anymore. And then there might be some crossing points, but the islands will be a little bit different than what we think about today. And then the third scenario, because again, I fight with aging, so I still want to say and think me of being very young and therefore optimistic. I want to think of a world where there might be a new world order, where the big three at least, and if not the others, with China, Russia, China, the EU, the US, and then with other countries, they might have a new agreement. In when can you use sanctions? Because again, going back to what I told you before, that confrontation, that misunderstanding of what the UN is supposed to be doing is still there, and it fractures the Security Council. One part of the Security Council says that the UN can do it, the others that cannot do it, because sanctions are seen as a very exceptional tool. While in certain parts of the world, here in the West, we use sanctions for a lot of reasons that go way beyond security. So human trafficking, organized crime, money laundering. Sanctions are used for all these kind of low-level security or crimes, not even security challenges. But then maybe with an agreement according to which we can use sanctions only in certain moments. Maybe that could be a factor to make us look at the future in a more optimistic way, and a future where we sanctions each other less because the economy and the countries can find an agreement again for the future. I talked too much. Thank you very much for your kindness, and I look forward to the questions and the conversation. Thank you.
I think it's perfect as also as a length, and thank you for your contribution. You introduced this evolution of sanctions. You were mostly in the multilateral framework of sanctions. You talked also of the secondary sanctions, and you introduced this new world of sanctions that is different from the previous one, from the globalization. If I may comment, it's a new world if we think in comparison with the 22 decades before. It's not a new world if we think before 89, because it was the normal. The norm was that you can trade not with everybody, because there are adversaries, are enemies. And in the Cold War, this was very, very, very clear. There were a lot of laws in the United States mostly, but also in other countries. Maybe the COCOM system. There was a full set of instruments that regulated the many, many aspects of international trade. And you can calculate that a big, big part of trade was simply restricted. Then after the fall of the wall, after 89, we had the markets took the control over the controls, and basically created the interdependencies of the globalized world, where now we are somehow going back, but not back to what was before, because this was another system. So we are in the middle of a transition. We have a new globalization that is taking shape according some lines, some regions, some islands, as you mentioned. But most of the laws are too old, because they refer to laws of the Cold War time that are not fit for today's time. And before giving the floor to Nicolas, I would like also to put one point. in my opinion, when we talk of sanctions, we have to take some confusion out of our mind. We don't talk of sanctions like you are sanctioned because for application of the international law. This is not the kind of sanctions we are looking. Sanctions are just a restriction put from some states, and it's an act of force. But instead of using a military force, is used economic force. This is the way sanctions should be intended. There can also be, especially if you are in the UN multilateral system, the sanctions applied by the Security Council because a break of the international legal system. But most of the sanctions we are dealing with are unilateral sanctions or sanctions produced by a group of countries. And these are not, this is not the application as sanctions because a law was violated. It's sanctions because I want to coerce you. So the target of the sanction is somebody I want to put an economic cost in order to divert him from his behavior. And if he doesn't want to change his behavior, he has to pay an economic cost. So it's not basically the application of a law inside a system against the violator. It's basically an act of force that the West, mostly, and you will talk mostly about the Western sanctions, does according to the laws. But every country, even Russia, even China, China has a strong use of economy as a tool of coercion. It doesn't take the legal appearance of sanctions like we produce in the Western world, because the system is different. But the weaponization of economy is not something new. It's something very old, and it's something very, very, very old, because we can go back very much in time to see how economy is used as part of the curve of the force. So it's a very complex system where we are living, and complex are very tricky sanctions subject. So I hope that Nicolas Lamp will help to guide us in this world, and also to see how the Western sanctions, why they are special, and why some countries are under sanctions, other countries are not sanctioned for something that is happening, and what happens to the supply chains when sanctions are limiting the possibility of economic interdependence.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here. I wanted to focus on the second part of that sentence, the tombstone of globalization. If we want to really answer that question of whether sanctions are impacting whether we still have globalization, we of course have to have a sense of what did globalization look before. And Francesco already did a great job of breaking it down in very simple terms. You could just buy and sell from anyone. You could move almost anywhere. And this was also reflected in government policy. So most governments in the post-Cold War period adopted the following approach to trade policy. You should trade with everyone, especially also with countries that we may have disagreements with, such as Russia or China, because the hope was that if we trade with those countries, they will become more like us. So when China was admitted to the World Trade Organization in 2001, the hope was that the opening up of the economy would lead to a liberalization of the political system. Germany was very happy to trade gas with Russia, not only because it was cheap, but also because it thought that doing so would make Russia more peaceful, more reluctant to engage in aggressive behavior at the international stage. So the first mantra of that post-Cold War era was to say, we'll trade with everyone. I mean, there were some exceptions, maybe North Korea and Iran, the real outcasts, but largely we want to trade with everyone, and including those who are maybe strategic competitors. Another feature was we wanted to trade with everything. The European Union has a famous program called Everything But Arms, which allows least developed countries to import into the European Union everything except arms. And this is very much a good motto for thinking about how countries thought about trade. The more trade, the better, because the idea was the more we trade with more people we trade, the richer we were going to be, the better off we're going to be, and everything will be more beautiful. Okay? So this is a very crude summary of the approach to international economic governance that prevailed in the first 3 decades of the post-Cold War era. So what has changed in recent years? And I will put it to you that the more aggressive use of sanctions is only one aspect of what has changed. More broadly, what we're seeing is that governments are much more, have moved away from these two mantras that I just explained. They no longer think that you should be trading with everyone. And Francesco already did a great job about how, explaining how skeptical governments have become regarding trade with China, right? So if you want to build your 5G telecommunications infrastructure, you're not allowed to use Huawei equipment. If you want to export semiconductors, advanced semiconductors, you can't export them to China, right? So what is happening here, depending on the product that you're looking at or the service that you're looking at, governments are starting to limit whom you can trade with. And this is also, and I already mentioned that, like true for the products and services. Governments are now taking a very differentiated approach to which products and services you're allowed to trade. The United States is happy to export agricultural products to China. It's happy to import cheap electronics and garden chairs from China, but it doesn't want you to import sensitive equipment or dual-use equipment and export high technology and dual-use products. So what's happening here is that governments have moved away from these mantras, and they're trying much more actively to shape supply chains. They're trying to shape the global economy. And the security motivation is only one of those motivations. If we look to the European Union, we're seeing that the European Union is taking many quite aggressive measures in the name of climate change. For example, it is imposing a so-called carbon border adjustment mechanisms, which will impose charges on products depending on their carbon content. It has passed a very controversial so-called deforestation regulation, which bans the importation of products, of certain products like beef and soy and palm oil, unless you can show that those products do not come from an area that has been recently deforested. And as Paolo said, this is not about law. It's not about whether you illegally deforested. It's whether those areas have been deforested. And so countries are, both the European Union, especially Western governments, are taking much more aggressive unilateral measures to shape supply chains in ways that accord with their policy preferences, be it in the security realm, be it in the due to resilience concerns, or in the sustainability sphere. So now we run into a conceptual problem. We just heard very good definitions of what sanctions are. And the question that I had as I was thinking about this talk was, well, how are these other measures different from sanctions? When the European Union says to your farmer in Brazil or Indonesia, you cannot bring your product into this country, into the European market, unless you comply with all these requirements to show that you're not using deforested land, right? Or if the United States is imposing requirements that says you have to show, if you want to bring your product from the Xinjiang region in China to the United States, you have to prove that there was no forced labor used here. These measures are not typically included in what we would call sanctions, but they're very similar. They're not punishing you necessarily for a violation of the law. They're imposing additional requirements on you in which you have to comply with if you want to access the market. So they're imposing an economic cost unless you comply. And so what I want to suggest here is that there's no really a black and white distinction between sanction as traditionally understood and this broad array of unilateral measures that we're seeing now. I have to just mention one more example. I'm a trade lawyer by training. And one thing that the United States has done under the Trump administration was impose tariffs on almost all imported products, like a broad swath of imports from China, using a part of US law called Section 301, which allows the United States to impose tariffs when another country acts unreasonably. So it's not illegally, it's unreasonably, right? And the aim was to change Chinese practices. These weren't described as sanctions, but they're very similar, right? And so as we think about the way in which global governance is changing, we have to be attentive about the fact that sanctions as traditionally understood are only a very small part of the picture in which governments are trying to shape supply chains. And it's, again, as Francesco also pointed out, it's not just for security reasons, it's also for other reasons. Values like forced labor, right? Why do we care about it? It's partly because we don't want to consume products made with forced labor, climate change, and resilience. And so what we are seeing here in the last couple of years, and this is really what is changing globalization in my view, is this proliferation of unilateral measures adopted by governments that are trying to shape supply chains in line with certain policy objectives, leading, in the case of certain products, to friendshoring, as Francesco puts out, in certain instances to reshoring, so that production is brought back to the country, while at the same time leaving other areas of trade untouched, right? So you will, I promise you, in 10 years or 15 years, you'll still be able to import your the shell for your cell phone from China, or your garden shears, because there are no security concerns here, there are no sustainability concerns, right? So we're seeing this huge differentiated, very differentiated approach that governments are adopting to different products and different trading partners, a rise of unilateral measures, and sanctions are a subset of those, but we have to think very hard about how we define sanctions as compared to these other measures. And my proposition to you is there's more of a spectrum of coercion. The second point I want to make is how it looks from the other side, right? How does this look to China, to Russia, to the developing countries that are affected by all these new requirements that the European Union is imposing? And you may have seen the news. There was a big summit in Moscow hosted by Putin yesterday. Xi Jinping was there, Modi was there, and they were talking about a new, a just world order. And one of the main things they were objecting to was sanctions by the West. So they're trying to build systems to shield themselves from the sanctions. And so the discussion in the West is often very focused on our own concerns. Well, are these sanctions going to be effective? How are they going to affect our own companies? And these debates, are they justified? But we also have to be aware of the broader image that the West is projecting to the outside world. And here, from my experience, looking at narratives in China and Russia, sanctions are a figure very prominently in complaints by non-Western states about the hypocrisy and double standards of the West. So there's a perception that the West designs the rules, or had a leading role in designing international rules, the World Trade Organization, the IMF, and so forth. But as soon as those rules don't suit the West anymore, the West feels free to disregard them and impose these unilateral sanctions. And so as we think about sanctions, we have to think very aware of how they're experienced outside. And Paola put it very nicely, they're experienced as coercion. They're experienced as almost like akin to the use of force. And developing countries have for a very long time, for decades, tried to develop international law so that it would prohibit coercion, that it would prohibit outlaw coercion, even if it's not involves the use of force. They weren't successful in that endeavor. So the international law consensus is essentially that international coercion is not prohibited as long as it doesn't involve the use of force. But still, we have to be very attentive to the way in which the use of sanctions promotes this image that the West is hypocritical about international rules, that it has double standards, and especially when you're talking about the developing country, that it acts essentially as an imperialist, right? And so the charge that has been levied against measures like the EU deforestation regulation is that this is a form of green imperialism. Okay, so the final point that I want to make is a bit on a different topic, and this is the motivations for sanctions. We already talked about security. We also talked about other objectives, but when I talked to some people who were responsible for implementing sanctions in Germany recently, and the question, of course, always comes up, is this effective? Are the sanctions on Russia effective in depriving Russia of access to weapons? And he said, well, yeah, it's not, it doesn't, yes, of course, it's important whether it's effective, but that doesn't mean that we would get rid of the sanctions if we found that they're not effective, because sanctions also have an expressive value. They also have a value of saying we can't support Ukraine with weapons and money at the same time as we are helping Russia essentially gain access and build weapons that will then be used against Ukraine, right? Russia may be able to get those materials from somewhere else, from China, but at least we are not complicit. And so I think we shouldn't underestimate this moral or expressive value of sanctions, that you're saying, okay, this is behavior that we do not condone. We may not be able to stop it, but at least we're not complicit. And I think this is also something that we see in the demands increasingly in the West, that the West stop sending weapons to Israel, right? Will Israel's policy change if Germany or other European countries stop sending weapons to Israel? Probably not. But there is an important concern of being seen as being complicit in what Israel is doing here. And so as we talk about the effectiveness of sanctions, I think we also need to be attentive to these expressive and moral dimensions that are involved in sanctioning, right? Because you're sanctioning. If you don't sanction, you also kind of sanction the behavior. You somehow approve and support the behavior at issue. Thank you.
Very good, very deserved, because you enlarged also our vision. You put other restrictions that are not normally named sanctions. You talked about environment, of CBAM, and so on. So, and protectionism, because there is also this. The big question is: should we frame this extensive use of sanctions in a more broader protectionist tendency? This is there is a suspicion. Of course, there is over-regulation, there is over-compliance, and this is also, especially if you look from the point of view of the companies. It's not the objective of the motivation why you build a restriction system is not that important. What is important is the number of restrictions and obligations and compliance measures you have to deal with. And so from the business point of view, it can be perceived as a very complex environment. Still, I believe sanctions should be kept as focused on a very, very specific point of view, because the national security is there. Of course, there can be an abuse of sanctions, also for other reasons, of course. But the objective is very important. And in the case of sanctions put on for national security reasons, the objective is that there is a threat. It's not only a risk. There is a threat, there is a perpetrator, there is an aggressor, there is an enemy you want to make change his course of action. And you know that he will not change the course of action, because nobody after his invading a country will decide to go back because you put some economic sanctions. It's just you want to deprive him of economic resources that are feeding the war machine. So it would be very awkward if you would still keep running the profits of a country that is posing a national security threat to your system. Of course, it's very subjective, because national security, it is subjective. That's why the West has its own vision of security, and not even the West is let's say, as we see in there are countries that belong to NATO, like Turkey, for example, that don't apply sanctions to Russia. So it can be very subjective, how you recognize that is a threat and you want to apply sanctions. But just this was very, very good to have this broader picture. And now we make it even bigger, I think, because we will discuss also on, I think you will talk a specific case also on Russia frozen assets. Maybe we will talk also, but also the issue of what happens when there is an arbitration, or there is who is right inside sanctions, because somebody is acting against the sanctions legally, and what can happen in this case.
No, okay, it was not open. No, being the last one, what I was trying to do is to tell you also to discuss a different angle of globalization. In this sense, they both said that globalization means trading with everyone you want. But there is another aspect in globalization, which is being able to invest, to settle in another country, to have a project and build up structures in another country safely, in a sound way, and being protected to do so. So we also have in international economic law, in trade law, we also have another full set of rules that are called foreign investment law. And these have a peculiarity. They address directly private entities. So this is the only time, as Francesco was mentioning, whether it is legitimate or not to have sanctions against individuals, simply because international law is normally addressing states. Investment law has always been special because it addresses or finds protection directly for investors. So you can easily imagine that any kind of sanction has a direct impact on this kind of laws. And this is something that is normally less known. So this is the reason why I wanted to tackle that topic, to give you also another understanding of how things go. I must say, Paolo is right in mentioning the fact that I wanted to speak also of a specific case, which is, I guess, which concerns Russia. But I'm speaking of this because something happened that is of interest in general terms. As you know, I guess, at least if you were living in Europe at the time of the starting of the war with Ukraine, a lot of assets of Russian citizens were seized in Europe. So we had many Russian people having property in Europe that were seized, and bank accounts that were frozen. Together with this, some Russian assets, especially from the central bank of Russia, were frozen accounts. This is what is normally, this is not strange, it's not peculiar. This has been already done many times. But at some point, the debate was, in order to reconstruct Ukraine at the end of the war, or even previously, to buy some arms to help them to fight their war, can we use the interest that come out of frozen accounts? Because frozen assets are indeed frozen, but they stay theoretically in the property of the owner. It's something temporary that helps solving the public law or the public interest issues or national security issues that we have. But can we also use those interests for a specific purpose? Now, this for international law is an extremely complex issue that raised a number of problems, let's say, that that we need to address. One of the issues was, in the very first place, it's probably the more interesting somehow, it's whether central bank assets have immunity or not. I hope you are a bit familiar with international law, and so you should know that some assets are protected, are immune against any kind of claims when they pertain to the state and they are used for public purposes, not for commercial, but for public purposes. The money of central banks is by definition public because it normally serves for the state. But for instance, the money that was held in some banking infrastructure, I don't want to be too technical because I don't know whether you know what SWIFT is or what Euroclear is, but in any event, these are infrastructure of the banking sector to permit liquidation and compensation of payments also between states. So this is public by definition. So the real issue was, can we use those assets, or are these assets immune? Second point was this kind of approach, so using the interest of these accounts, can be considered to be a countermeasure against the acts of Russia. So in terms of state liability, can we use that money in the way we plan to use them? These were somehow new questions for international law. Not all of them, but for the first time, we had a number of systematic issues to be solved together. And if you follow news and newspapers, you should know that at G7, there has been quite a discussion between the US on the one side, they were in favor of this measure, and European states that were much more conservative. In particular, the European Central Bank did not like this approach because they believe that could be against international law. And at this point in time, we know that the US, Canada, and even the UK are in favor of this kind of measures. The other states are trying to figure out solutions that might be sort of middle way. But the real point is not who's right or who's wrong. So this is legal theory. I mean, this legal theory, not legal theory, legal international law issues that we can delve upon, extremely complicated. But the point is, for the first time, we are assisting to different solutions that might strongly change the approach. The real issue was, whatever solution we decide now, it might be a precedent for the future. So what we are now doing in this situation might be repeated tomorrow in some other cases. We might like it or not, it might be against us. So the real issue was, where do we want to go? And these are issues that concern public international law, but but they have an effect also on private deals and the way you do businesses. And that is why I was mentioning arbitration and investment law, because aside from this extremely sophisticated issue of immunity of assets, you do have also the issue of how do you address these issues under the current status of investment law. You might know, I have no idea whether you are familiar with this legislation, so sorry for saying things that probably are very basic to you. I have really no idea. But how do you protect a foreign investor? Normally under a non-discrimination principle that has a different articulation. One of these is the so-called FET, the FET standard, fair and equitable treatment. You have to treat a foreign investment fairly, which means, among the many, you should not infringe legitimate expectations of an investor. So once you have made an investment, you do expect that your investment is protected also against risk in national security. So even when something occurs from a national security point of view, you need to be protected. So here the issue is, how do you do so in this specific context? If you freeze an asset, are you indeed protecting the legitimate expectations of the investor? Similarly, you have another set of rules that say that a state cannot expropriate a good, or you can expropriate, so no expropriation without compensation. So it's not really that you cannot expropriate, but if you expropriate, you have to pay back the value and the market value of the asset. So it might be extremely expensive. When you put a sanction and you freeze an asset, and even if you do it temporarily, so even if you do it only for a limited period of time, investment law tells you that you should compensate. Otherwise, this is an expropriation. So you can imagine with these premises, we had a lot of arbitration cases, investment arbitration cases, which is very good for me because I'm an arbitrator. It's not so good for the economy in general, because it's something that costs a lot of money. It's something that indeed jeopardizes globalization in the sense that eliminates trust, even when it is for an extremely legitimate purpose. Because here the issue is no one challenge the fact that the measure might be appropriate for national security. The issue is how can you balance this interest with the protection of the private sector and the investors. And now you can imagine a real commercial battle started through arbitration, in the sense that we had arbitration in many places and we had fights on measures and on parallel proceedings. So we are now having is, because of course, I forgot to say something that you should know, but that it's not only that Europe or European states imposed some sanction and freezing measures. Also, Russia did with European companies in Russia. For instance, there are Italian banks, German and Italian banks that have secondary. They have some seats, some branches in Russia, and they had to reduce the kind of activities because of the measures that the European central banks imposed on them. And the result was a countermeasure by Russia itself, which produced arbitration again. So you have many arbitration open. When you have an award, you cannot find a place where you can execute it, because of course, in the other country, they try to say that they don't recognize it. You have cases even in Singapore, so really all around the world, where one tribunal ask for an injunction measure prohibiting a party to start a case, a claim in another country. And then you get the reverse, which is an anti-injunction measure by the other tribunal. End of the story. Not only fragmentation, but lack of certainty altogether. So this comes at a time where there was already a big discussion, which had nothing to do with sanctions, on the soundness of all of these rules, because rules of investment, of foreign investment, made a lot of sense in the 80s, or when there was a logic of Western companies or companies with technology going in developing countries, giving technology and requesting in exchange safety and soundness. Now we have a much more, we don't have such a one-way process any longer. Now investments are more spread around, and as a country, you are normally both home and host country of a company. So the scenario, the framework has changed completely, with the result that all this is put in under discussion. So when sanction arrived in a situation where there was already a lot of discussion on the appropriateness of the tools that we have in investment law, you can easily imagine what that meant for globalization, for the general premises we would work on. Does this mean the sanctions are a tombstone of globalization? I would say no. No, also on what I said, even if I sounded quite dramatic, I think that the reality of things will simply be, we will get something different. I would say that some premises will change, and the kind of pillars that we had after the Second World War are today under discussion. But believe me, sanctions are an essential part, but are absolutely not the only reason why we today have this kind of discussion. So we have to put that into a context, because otherwise you don't understand the substance and the relevance of one policy measure, because the policy measure has to be evaluated in a context, as I think it emerged for what is said. My understanding that at least in investment law, we are going through new generation of treaties on investments, new forms of protection, new forms also of obligation of investment of investors based on sustainability. So we are going toward a different world, not I would say not the end of globalization, whatever globalization means, but a different kind of. What we all struggle is to try to really figure out how this will be. But I think we all agree that there will be substantial changes, and the future will not be the same as the past, at least in my understanding.
Thank you very much. Wow. Wow, another, the picture gets more and more bigger and bigger. Few comments, but please make some questions. We still have some 20 minutes before the end, so we would like to collect some questions from you. Already, wow. Frozen asset of Russian central bank. This is very important because there has been cases previously, but of very smaller dimension. I think was Iran, but the central bank of Iran is much smaller. The economy was much smaller, and much smaller were the assets frozen. Probably there is another case. I don't know if it's Cuba or another one, but we are talking of very little economies and little figures involved. Another point is where were those assets? Where in Europe? Because Russia used to hold its state reserves in US dollars and in euro, and a little before the war, they sold basically what they had in US dollars, and they moved it to China. So they moved it in China and in Europe. So that's why Europe plays an important role, because there are 2 or 3 countries in Europe, and probably UK as well, that have got a big part of those frozen assets. That's why Europe has a different position compared to the US, because the trust, these assets are held in euro, and Europe wants to maintain euro. Europe wants to maintain euro as a trustable place where to put reserves and assets. So they don't want to lose the trust of the world state investment community. And that's why they have to treat those assets according to the law. This is very important. Trust that you mentioned, we have at stake. That's why the European Central Bank is somehow suspicious about this. And then another thing, just to make it more complicated, but I think at the very end of the picture, we have to put other figures. That is the war reparations. Because at the end of the war, there will be also issue of physical assets in Ukraine that has been destroyed. And also there is a legal obligation to pay for the destructions. And somehow frozen assets and reparations will enter into a dialogue. This is a question mark, I don't know, but we have to think about this. And also the magnitude of the 2 figures is quite comparable. So we have to think that there is also the issue of the reconstruction of Ukraine. Then you mentioned the issue of buying weapons, but this is another more complicated case. So, but France, I think, is started using the interest of the frozen assets to buy weapons for Ukraine, I think, in the last days. Anyway, there were questions. So please, I would say we collect 2 or 3, and then we give to every speaker the floor.
Okay, I'm Pietro Magnasco. I wanted to ask you, having established that these sanctions and the blooming of sanctions, these different perception in recent years, everything is not a tombstone to globalization. I would say that it's a more a symptom of the division we are seeing. How do you think right now sanction will become something that makes more effect in the area of influence of the country uses them, like the West uses sanction, but they really are more effective inside its own ecosystem? Because if we see like the sanction against Russia, for example, they were circumnavigated in some cases through other countries like Kazakhstan, like merch was imported to Kazakhstan and then to Russia. So they, through a different sphere of influence, they were able to avoid some of these sanctions. So how these different sphere of influence between the West, the BRICS, the other actors, third actors, how these influences, sanctions, are they perceived and they're made? Thank you.
Can you tell your name? So you were? Pietro. Okay, the question one from Pietro. Question two from?
Hello, my name is Aisha Marzakhanova. I think my question is a little bit similar to Pietro's question. Okay, so a question to every respected speakers. My question is, can economic sanctions provide an incentive to strengthen the national economy in the long term, encouraging domestic development and structural reforms? For example, as happened in Russia, where sanctions led to import substitution programs and the development of alternative financial systems. And could these paths lead to sustainable growth and innovation in other countries? So thank you.
One over there.
Okay, first of all, thank you all for your presentations. I would like to ask a question to all the relatives, really. We've already talked about the real function of an economic sanctions, which is not that of hurting the country that is the target of the sanctions themselves, but that of not being complicit in the actions of the country that is the target of the sanctions. Now, however, the public opinion, especially here in Italy, still seems to be completely unaware of the real functional questions, because a lot of people complain about the fact that they have damaged us and the European Union more than actually Russia, and the fact that Russia hasn't collapsed yet, as a lot of people say. Do you think this misunderstanding, as all of you, do you think this misunderstanding is due to bad communication by the institutions, or by because of some stubbornness in the public opinion? Thank you.
There are other two questions.
Okay, we take these two and then the answer.
Okay, thank you very much for adding a fourth question to it. So my question is, it kind of relates to the introduction to this panel. It says in the brief about it that, as he was saying, sanctions can be a double-edged sword, right? On the one hand, they harm the West. On the other hand, they're used by the West, as in the case of Russia, as it was well argued. So my query is really about liberalism and sanctions. So on the one hand, you have the West, which is using institutions such as the Magnitsky Act from 2012 or the EU Magnitsky Act from 2020 to target specific assets, to froze those assets, et cetera, and as it was argued, to use the interest on those assets to finance Ukraine. Terrific. But at the same time, the West is not really conducting that much due diligence on, say, online banking, Wise, Revolut, PayPal, and all that jazz. So we all know for a fact, I guess, on this panel as well as in this room, that you can transfer money from any Russian bank to a bank in Kazakhstan or Uzbekistan or the PRC or the DPRK, really anywhere, and then you can transfer it via PayPal on Wise, Revolut, and swap it to euro and yen or US dollars at little but no fee. And this is not just, say, the average Joe doing it, transferring, say, a few thousands, it's millions, as it was in the case argued by the Moldovan president, right? That they expelled the Russian citizen not that long ago because he had done exactly this with millions, right? Transferring from Moldova to Russia and vice versa. So the question really is not as much how much sanctions are effective, because we know what they do, what they don't, but really, given that we need to grow our economics, is the incentive really on putting sanctions, or is the incentive on, yeah, we do that, but really we incentivize online banking and different systems because we need to incentivize investment, exchanges, and at the end of the day, really, how useless was to kick out the Russian Federation of the SWIFT banking system? I mean, it does harm industries, but not individuals as it intended to, right? So can you argument a bit on these two dimensions? Because it's something, yeah, I'm curious about. Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Beatrice Gentile. Thank you for taking my question also. Okay, so assuming that the sanctions will end as soon as the state complies with international law, and if the economic sanctions are the tombstone of globalization, to what extent will this sanction damage the possibility of future relationship between the two states? Thank you.
Okay, so these are very good questions, and we have five questions. So I would suggest maybe each of you or each of us pick up one or one and a half, or not all, otherwise we will not finish in time. So
So I would just quickly.
You want to take? Yeah.
I mean, just
Which one you want?
quickly, I'll try to. I mean, one theme is the effectiveness of sanctions, right? And so you mentioned transshipment. Again, it's not wholly ineffective because, of course, Kazakhstan, they're going to take a big cut. So at least it makes it more expensive, right? It puts obstacles in and it drains economic resources from the economy. But what you describe is, of course, also true, right? Sanctions almost invariably have unintended effects. There was just this companies or countries find ways to substitute for the products, right? So there was just a fascinating report in The Economist about how no resource is really strategic, because if you put pressure on it, countries will find workarounds, right? And in the case of Russia, what's really ironic is that some of the economic developments in terms of import substitution might be seen as desirable from Russia's perspective and also from other countries, right? So it actually may lead to economic developments in the country which are not only negative. And I mean, Russia is, of course, a special case, so big, has so many resources, right? So if you look at Iran or Iraq, the sanctions were much more devastating. So that then brings us back to this expressive value. I think it would be difficult for politicians to step forward and say, look, this is not going to have any effect, but we're doing it because we don't want to be complicit. I think it's really, it's part of the, but so I don't know whether politicians will ever get there and admit that it will not be effective, because that will provoke a backlash. But ultimately, I think as we think about sanctions and also about the after effect of sanctions, that is an important dimension, right? Whether the sanctions are going to come off Russia, I don't think it's just the end of the war. It also depends on the post-war settlement. To what extent does Russia pay reparations and so forth? So I could imagine that the sanctions will stay in place for decades, simply because of that. And then it will be more that expressive dimension that will be at stake. At that point, they won't have any economic effect, but it's really a signal: are you one of us or not?
Okay. I think the question number 5 will be Maria Chiara at the end. So we have left the positive effect on sanction on target countries' economy. We have the public opinion issue and liberalism and sanctions. Any of these three you would like to take, maybe?
Yes. Well, first of all, thanks again for the interventions, and thanks for the questions. This is a super interesting panel. Your questions triggered so many things that I need to say, so I need to make sure we go home today. I'll try to make a few points and collect a few questions. So indeed, yes, there is a possibility. This is comes, there is a literature. I don't remember who asked the question on the positive. Maybe you. It's an article that was published in 1967, saying, listen, there is a classic rally around the flag effect. Indeed, if you sanction a country, it's likely that the people will have to choose whether they stick with the sanctioner or with the government. Very often they stick to the government, and they build up even a stronger resilience to the foreign intervention because they have to pick up and choose. And of course, there could be an import substitution effect. Now, did you go to North Korea? All these things that you're talking about and I just mentioned are taking place. Did you see a development, glowing, and then possibly that there is a problem, right? It really depends on whether you can do it. And don't think that acquiring a certain degree of technology, it's an easy thing. You just learn how to build the nuclear bomb. And think about this. The nuclear bomb is a very old technology. We mastered this in the 40s. Is there anything that you can use, that you can see around that comes from the 40s beyond the building, by the way, here? It's hyper old still. We went to the moon in the 60s. Yet, the difficult part for many of these countries is to develop the bomb safely and to develop the technology that allows you to throw it far away safely with a certain degree of certainty. It's not easy to reinvent technology from scratch. You can steal it, you can try, but it's actually very complicated to do it. So the short answer is yes, it can happen. It's not that easy for that to happen when it comes to that. Then there is the big issue of triangulation, liberalism, and the real functions of sanctions. I think these are the three things. Then I want to say three things. First, this goes back to the very first thing I wrote on sanctions. I didn't call it expressive, but I was trying to address the research puzzle is why, when I started to work on sanctions, the academic literature was basically unanimously saying sanctions do not work. What we heard even a lot of arguments today. Sanctions don't work. You close the academic stuff, you open up the Financial Times, everyone was using sanctions. Now, who was wrong? The academics or the policymakers? And then that's the kind of puzzle I started to work with at the beginning. And in reality, there is no one real function of sanctions. There are a number of functions of sanctions. Sanctions can coerce. Sanctions can constrain. So coercing is I make you do what you wouldn't do otherwise. The constraining, if I put you in jail, I don't change your will, but I change your capacities because you can't do much harm if you're locked up in jail. And then there is the signaling function. Very many people wrongly compare the 2014 sanctions on Russia with the 2022. There are two different universes. And the sanctions that were imposed in July 2014. When did Crimea become independent? And therefore, and afterwards are next to Russia? Anyone? Are you studying IR? 2014, which month? Details are important. Come on, no one. Did you hear the question? When did Crimea vote the referendum to become independent, and then it went to the annexation of Russia? Which month in 2014, correctly, in the year? March, good check. March 2014. Heavy sanctions happened in 2014 in July. Why? The fights in the Donbass started in April, May. Still heavy sanctions, which were not comparable at all to the ones that we've seen in February and in the 14 packages. They happened 3-4 months later. Why? What happened? Is there anyone from the Netherlands here? No one. Anyone who remembers what happened in July 2014? It's coming out. I can see you. Remember the big crash, the Malaysian Airlines. Yes, big plane, lots of Dutch citizens, crashes because a couple of idiots decide to make a mistake with a weapon, provided by Russia possibly, and then almost 200 Dutch citizens die. Do you think that the Dutch government could have done nothing in July to respond to that? And that explains part of it. So don't think about sanctions just being against the target. There is an audience. Think about COVID. And you watched a football match in February 2020 and a football match in April 2020. What was the difference? No one in the stadium. How did the players celebrate scoring a goal? It was the same goal, but they celebrated in a very different way, because running and yelling in an empty stadium, you look like an idiot. You need the people, and then you respond to the audience. So very often sanctions is a way of communicating. You communicate to the targets, you communicate to the audience, you communicate to your own audience. The heaviest sanctions that the US imposed on Cuba were imposed in 1996, after the Cold War. And the question is why? Again, there are always different reasons that you dig a little bit deeper. And then again, the real functions of sanctions is a number of sanctions at the same time. Then, so that was the idea of thinking about, tripartite typology of coercing, constraining, and signaling. That makes sense to me, at least, to make sure that we know that sanctions don't do one thing only. They do a number of things. And then final point on the also on the triangulation. Don't think it's easy to do this, as you just described, in vast magnitude. And don't think of sanctions as something you use and then things work like that. Sanctions is more like a speed limit. When you drive in the highway, there is always someone who goes faster than 130. Does it mean that the speed limit doesn't make any sense? You will say no, because some idiot goes faster than 130. But then what you need to check is the average speed of cars. And if you manage to decrease and to lower the average speed, that's how sanctions work. Think in terms of regimes, don't think in terms of black and white. They either work, they don't work. There is always some deviation. Drugs, any kind of laws that we can think of, there is always deviation. Doesn't mean that prohibiting the sale of drugs, heavy drugs in the street and in the pharmacies is a bad idea, because you can still buy drugs somewhere and somehow. And of course, the answer is no, it really depends. And then it depends on the degrees. And then the final point, you gave me 3 questions, so I'm speaking a lot. But then that's the last point. Right, sanctions, skepticism. Sanctions might not work. They might not achieve 100% of what we state. What would work better? Because that's what boils down to. Sanctions is a part of a bigger strategy. There is a combination of foreign policy instruments. You can decide to do nothing. You can decide to talk, diplomacy. Well, you can decide to go to war. Of course, you can prevent North Korea from having a nuclear technology. You just bomb Pyongyang, and then you invade North Korea. In the meantime, something might happen in Seoul. Do you know how big is Seoul? How many people live in Seoul? Over 20 million people. And it's very close to the border. Maybe there is a dirty bomb that goes off downtown Seoul. Maybe 500,000 people die. Okay, you still, it's good. You remove the nuclear technology from North Korea. But the price you pay is damn high. So again, think about it in terms of alternatives. Don't think that there is a quick solution to this very complicated crisis. And the fact that sanctions don't achieve everything all at once does not mean that sanctions do not work. Always think in terms of alternatives. Because again, and then I close, there is this very opening sentence of an article, The Social Logic of Choice by Baldwin. It was written in the late 90s. And he starts saying, listen, swimming is a very bad way of going around. If you are in Rome and you want to go to the US, you just don't walk to the sea and you start swimming. You would look like not very efficient way of going to New York. What if you're in the middle of the ocean and the only way you can survive is to swim? Well, then you start swimming as soon as you can and you hope for the better.
Thank you, Francesco. I think we more or less answered all of your questions. So just 2 final remarks before ending this session. I think the question if sanctions are effective is not well posed, because sanctions are basically a tool, an instrument, as Francesco said. Do you ask, do diplomacy works? Yes, sometimes it works, sometimes it fails. Do international law works? Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. Does war works? Sometimes it's negative, the effects of the war, sometimes it's positive for a country. So this you can do everything. This a tank, does it work? It depends. Sometimes it destroys the target. Sometimes it's destroyed itself. So you cannot ask this generally, this question. You have to get not to the tool, you have to concentrate to the objective, the political objective, why the sanctions are imposed. And the political objective is secret, because it's strategy. So you never know why a country decide to put a certain amount of sanctions. It's very difficult to evaluate, because you should evaluate something that you cannot clearly study or put under evaluation of a policy, because it's inside the secrets of the states. And you should know a lot about, maybe in the future in the archives, you can do it. So this is very difficult, very tricky, the evaluation. And the other comment, sanctions are not the tombstone of globalization, I would say. My answer is no. I don't know yours, but I think more or less we all agree. But we have to be careful, because war, the return of war, is the tombstone of globalization. And sanctions are a hybrid thing, because sometimes they are a liberal alternative to war. Democracies don't want to go to war, so they use sanctions. But sometimes sanctions it's a shortcut to go to war, because they work the other way around. Instead of stopping a war, it's a way how to go into a war. So this is the problem is the hybrid concept of the use of economic force. That is the big question. And this lies specifically in the middle of this process of redescribing the globalization. So thank you very much. Please thank Nicolas, Maria Chiara, and Francesco for their contribution. And thank you very much.
No, perché la